You all are muted on entry, so if you do have a question, please raise your hands or also come to the chat window to put any comments. This meeting is being recorded and will be published on Rival later on. And this is an interactive call, though I have a presentation. I'll be using that presentation to really drive the conversation. It's not about me presenting and you asking a question in the end. So at any point, if you have any question, please raise your hand or put your comments in the chat window, and I'll pick them up as I go along. The presentation is already published on Driver, where the meeting invite is, if you want to look at the slides as I'm going through them. So the agenda is I'm going to start with Intro to News 2. We're going to look at high-level use cases, and I'll provide you an example News 2 use case. We'll look at a bit of background on curation if this is the first time you're joining this call. And then we'll start looking at high-level decisions, design decisions we had made and observations, and vital signs for UK, followed by invites for first-type sites and vendors and your questions. And we'll finish with any other business. So this agenda is a draft agenda. If any of you have got any comments or want to include items in any other business, please feel free to write them in the chat window and we'll pick them up in the end of the meeting. So brief overview for News 2. News has evolved from National Early Warning Score, which was news which was published by Royal College of Physicians in 2012. It only applies to adult patients over age 16, and it doesn't apply to children and pregnant women. It was initially developed to improve the detection and response to clinical deterioration of patients of acute illness. It's used for initial assessment and monitoring of patients in mostly hospital settings, but increasingly it's also recommended in pre-hospital settings like ambulance, before the patient is brought in to hospital. According to the last survey from RCP, 90% of NHS hospitals are using some form of early warning score, and 75% are already using News. As you can see from the screen, it has got 6 simple physiological parameters: respiration rate, oxygen saturation, systolic blood pressure, pulse rate, level of consciousness, and temperature. This is how News 2 looks like. On top you got some scores. On left you got the parameters I talked about, which are, as I said, respiration rate and systolic blood pressure, pulse, consciousness, temperature. There are a few changes from News if you're already familiar with News. One is the addition of SpO to scale 1 and 2, which you can see in the row, and they are both not used at a given time. Only one of them is used, and SpO to scale 2 is recommended to be used in patients with hypercapnic respiratory failure, mostly in cases of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. But there are other cases patient might be in hypercapnic respiratory failure. But the clinician has to make a decision whether they're going to use SpO to scale 1 or scale 2 for a given patient and use the reference ranges provided. And the other change from News is they have added new confusion. If you look at the consciousness, there is alert, which is a 0.0, and then you get CVPU, the C, which stands for new confusion. The standard scale before that was AVPU, which included the patient being alert or responding to verbal or pain or unresponsive, and you get a score of 3 for new confusion. By adding new confusion, they have aligned it to sepsis. Now News 2 can be used to identify sepsis. A News 2 score of 5 and above creates a risk for patient beyond sepsis, and it covers all the indicators of the existing sepsis tool, which has got respiratory rate, blood pressure, and new confusion. There are other changes in the tooling, which include the way colors are shown, and they are quite visual, and the order of all the parameters. I would recommend you look at the RCP report. What I'm highlighting is what we found was relevant to our design in FHIR So these are the key changes we had to take into account while designing. So the scope of NEWS2 is defined by a new work commission which we received from NHS England, which is in the meeting invite, which looks at the curation of NEWS2 observation and information models based on existing work. PRSB has already, the Professional Request Standards Body has already done some work on observations as part of maternity, and there's existing work available from OpenEHR and observations as well. As part of this work, we will be creating level 2 and level 3 profiles. I will go into the definition of these in a minute when we come to the bit of background on Care Connect. And finally, the delivery of FHIR STU3 alpha specification with implementation guidance and SNOMED CT codes for the parameter observations which are included. The alpha here means there's a link here. You can follow it to take us NHS digital policy statement on alpha, which is a initial test specification which is subject to change. What is out of scope is that we are not going to do detailed information models for individual parameters like blood pressure. So the blood pressure might have just systolic and diastolic. It's not going to have all possible nodes like the lying position or the cuff size. So these are going to be quite basic set of parameter observations, and we are not going to do any more clinical assurance on that because the basic observations are already assured by the PRSB as part of the existing use cases. So once we got the new work commission, we have been discussing as internally with NHS Digital with the core team that what are the possible use cases for sharing of NEWS2, which is different from implementing NEWS2, which might be replacing a news template in a NEWS2 with an EPR. But once a NEWS2 is recorded, what are the use cases for sharing the total score or the sub-scores or individual observations? Most of our work is based on the first use case, which is a sharing of NEWS2 from an APR to a third-party application, which might do a clinician alert or onward workflow. So I've got a slide which is going to talk about a bit more about this use case. Other use cases we have is ambulance to emergency departments. Again, that's a separate new work commission, and we'll be considering that as part of that new work commission, that how NEWS2 fits into overall workflow of ambulance staff doing a handover to emergency department. And the final is transfer patient between hospitals, for which at the moment we have no new work commission, but I think our view is that this is best considered as an overall holistic use case and NEWS2 how it fits into it. So this is the use case for sharing NEWS2 from EPR. So the user story, and again, this is a presumed use case. We actually don't have a real use case given to us. And what I'm keen to hear from people who are attending this call is, first of all, their view on this use case, how realistic it is. But also, if you have any real use case on the ground for NEWS2 sharing, what kind of workflow would you envisage? And if you could share that with us on the call after I finish the use cases, because I'm going to stop after the use cases to come back to the attendees to say if you have any use cases that you would like to for us to look into. So this use case is, as a clinician, I can share the NEWS2 total score, parameters, and subscores and values. So the third-party application could integrate into the application and use to drive onward workflow for clinicians alert or decision support. So the current process, we are aware that it is recorded in clinical system or news, if not NEWS2, but we're not aware how it is shared for any onward workflow. So that is our patient and the clinicians. And I think the important bit for a clinician is we are assuming the clinician who is completing the NEWS2 is competent enough to understand the difference between SpO2 scale 1 or SpO2 scale 2. They themselves know what hypercapnia is, so they are going to make that decision to use which scale to use and put a sub-score for that based on the oxygen saturation. We're not expecting they will be receiving any external decision support to make that decision. The sending system will be the sending system which is where the NEWS2 is recorded, and there is a third-party application which is receiving it. So the main flow is patient is presenting at the hospital. The clinician records the patient observation for NEWS2 in the clinical system. The clinical system calculates the total score based on sub-scores entered by clinician. So one alternative path is that the system actually calculates the subscores based on actual observation recorded by a clinician. So that's a possibility as well. The clinical system sends the total score to the third-party application, and third-party application integrates it for workflow. And exceptions are it might not be, the third-party application might not be available. So before I come to you for your comments on the use case, I just want to quickly finish the clinical scenario. The clinical scenario is that Mr. Smith is a 50-year-old male who attends the emergency department with fever, cough, and pleuritic pain with falling vitals. They've got respiration rate of 21 beats per minute, 21 per minute, oxygen saturation of 93%. They are on air, not on oxygen. Systolic blood pressure 120, heart rate is 95 per minute, and consciousness, they are alert, they're not confused, and temperature is 37.5. Now, that's what it looks like in the news too. So respiration rate is 21. You go to the chart of the value 21 and 24. That's a score of 2. Oxygen saturation, we are using SpO2 scale 1, is 93%. And you go to 93%, which is a 92 to 93, you get a score of 2. Is patient air on oxygen? Patient's on air. You go there, and on air is a score of 0. On oxygen is a score of 0, and risk is 0. And systolic blood pressure 120, which is normal, which is go to 1 to 219 range, which is 0. And then you go to pulse, which is 95. In this case, 91 to 110, you get a score of 1. And consciousness alert, which is 0, and everything else is 3. And temperature is 38.5 in this case. And then you get a score of 1 with a total new score of 6. That's the way scoring works. All you need to know is which scale to use in oxygen saturation, and then you go to the chart, and that's enough information to calculate the score and subscores. So I think I'm going to stop here to get some feedback on the use case itself and what other use cases people think they have on the ground for NEWS2 sharing. Anybody who would like to share any use cases they might use or already have?
Manish, it's Anne here from Orion.
Hello, Anne.
Hi, the use case that you've outlined, we have clients already working with in Scotland. However, the observations come directly off the medical device that's on wheels and taken from bed to bed around the ward. So it's not the clinician inputting the data, it's the medical device inputting the data and then sending that directly to our system to be presented in the EPR.
Okay, so you're saying the clinicians record the raw observations and then they get NEWS2 score after that?
No,
or NEWS score?
No, the clinician takes the device, wheels the device to the bedside, attaches the blood pressure cuff to the patient, and they don't actually transcribe anything. The machine takes the vital signs directly. Obviously, they would have to do the temperature manually, but the ones that come off the device are automated. So actually, the device and the software within that device is all one integrated unit, and what we get outputted is the observations and the score already calculated.
Okay, so you've got device integration with the blood pressure machine.
Yeah.
Okay. John?
Yeah, one of the challenges with NEWS2 is, interestingly, ironically, it's slightly a step backwards because it sort of discourages automation to some degree because there are a couple of key things that need human decision. So the state of confusion is now very much down to the clinician again to make that decision, and potentially the decision on which oxygen scale, whether it's sort of type 2 respiratory failure, and therefore on that sort of scale 2, decision needs to be made too. So it does add a level of complexity in that you do need to kind of have those human recorded inputs in addition to the automated device input too.
Yeah, I think we discussed that. There are use cases, and I think Mike is on the call, who was CCIO at Liverpool, that some clinicians actually are not competent to make that decision. So that creates a situation that they actually need some kind of on-the-fly support. But I think that's a very complicated use case where they are sending base observation and they don't know which skill to use.
Yeah, I think that is going to become a more broader training issue for the NHS, in that reliance on HTAs today, who might not be competent to understand the difference between a sort of scale 1 and scale 2, and also not so confidently make a decision around confusion. That will have to be addressed by the NHS, and the way to address that will be training. But that does agree that does present a challenge for a number of our sort of customer organisations.
Okay, thanks. I got Mike. Mike, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's Mike Fisher here, CCIO from Liverpool. That's absolutely true, of course, that the News 2 score is less automatable because of the things that you've just discussed. But having said that, although that's a downside from an automation point of view, there's no doubt that from a clinical point of view, new confusion in a person is a very ominous sign, and should quite properly be taken account of in any meaningful score that's going to try and reflect the clinical state of that person. I think confusion is difficult enough. I think we had a lot of discussion about this, and it is true that the decision as to whether to use scale 1 or scale 2 is even more complex, which is why at the moment the thing is in there that we've, just for the time being, we haven't attempted to solve that problem from a computational point of view. We've just said that that it's going to be the responsibility of the people who are originating the score to make a correct decision as to whether the person should be assessed on scale 1 or scale 2. But that being the case, and also the thing that the previous person from Orion brought up about device integration, all of that is absolutely true, but it doesn't impact, of course, on the structures for sharing the news score once it's actually been derived, which is actually what this FHIR specification is all about.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Pranita?
Sorry, I just missed that.
It's Pranita Mishra. Your hand is up. I don't know whether you're calling user, because there are a lot of calling users. I'll unmute them all. Pranita, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I think Mike has replied to my question. It's just on scale 2, because what we got as a feedback, I'm from DXC, that healthcare workers generally, take the recordings in patients for patients, and would there be a use case where a scale 2 needs to be used, come from a qualified clinician, or how are we going to implement that kind of use case? That is what I wanted to know. But I think what Mike said, that it is still not yet decided, so we will just go with that they have the people who are recording the data are competent enough to take scale 2. So
yeah, thanks. So I think we have had that discussion covering the scope of having some kind of decision support by a third-party server where some expert clinician responds to it will actually create a couple of interactions. It's not a single call. And I think that will create different type of spec about kind of query sent and kind of response you get. And I think that will be different design for a different use case. But for the current use case, which is, we are assuming, is quite a straightforward spec to send scores and subscores and observations.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Mark?
Hello.
Mark, you want to come in? Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Just say I'm a technical person rather than a clinical person, but the decision in NHS Wales, so I represent NHS Wales Informatics Service. The decision in Wales, the clinical decision in Wales, is not to use automated recording of news scores. We're involved in a nursing project to record news rather than news 2. Obviously, there's a lot of crossover. The kind of use cases we're seeing now is the ability to, for instance, if we have an application that displays a list of patients on a ward, to be able to display the latest news score for those patients on that list. So we want to see that, you know, the latest news value, as well as being able to graph the individual scores, you know, the temperature, the respiratory rate, and so on. So the focus on our work so far has really been around how we structure the news score, the FHIR resource, or FHIR resources, so that we have one news score observation, and which contains the 6 or 7 nested parameter as observations in right. So we do that, you know, graphing of the temperature if we wanted to. So our focus really has been around that structure. I'm pleased to hear that you said, you know, the focus will be on sort of basic observations. That's the route we've chosen. We are choosing we're putting diastolic and systolic in blood pressure as well.
Okay, sounds good. We're doing similar stuff. So we're going to cover a lot more of how the individual parameters are going to be captured or related to the news 2 score in coming slides. Okay, so anybody else? Pranita, your hand is still up, and Mark, your hand is still up. If people could put their hand down once they're finished, so that I know for future. Okay, so we'll move on. Let me close that window. Okay. So this is a bit of a background of curation. If this is the first call you joined, the FHIR curation, again, has been happening under INTEROPen umbrella, and Amir, who's on the call, started it. I took over in November 2017, and we implemented a new process and we did curation for transfer of care, which is already beta specs are published now. The same with GP Connect, and we also cover reasonable adjustments in pharmacy. And most of the work we are doing, we are trying to improve as we go along. So in this iteration of curation, we're looking to include first the type sites. So that's the reason Mike Fisher, who's as a CCIO of Liverpool, was part of our core team. Core team is individuals within NHS Digital, including terminologists and technical modelers and clinicians, but also PRSP clinicians and clinical informaticians, and also clinical safety, who actually prepare the pack you're looking at. And they work in the background, but we do want to have more suppliers engagement in the core team as well, especially suppliers who want to actively implement the spec as soon as we publish it. I briefly talked about Care Connect levels. There is a hyperlink which takes you to a lot of detail if you're interested in the definitions, but in principle, level 1 is STU3, which is started in trial use 3 of FHIR, baseline international resource, which is published at HL7 International website. Level 2 is the UK localization of level 1, which implies that we try to use as much of level 1 as possible and with as minimal changes as possible, but there are times we have to make changes for UK localization, for example, adding NHS number or SNOMED CT, which is not their international base. Level 3 is UK specific, use case specific. It's for transfer of care. In this case, the use case is news 2, so we'll have a level 3 for news 2, and that allows us to make very specific changes for those news 2, like making certain fields mandatory, which will not apply to level 2. We also have a concept of a level 2 extension library, which means we can add additional elements to level 2s, but they are reusable across different use cases in a library. So coming to the NEWS2 itself, let me go through the high-level approach. What we have used is observation resource. FHIR has got a number of resources within it, including condition and procedures. We feel the observation resource is the best fit for NEWS2. So as you can see, observation resource in this picture has got a code element which will carry a SNOMED CT code for NEWS2 total score, and the value will carry the total score. There's also category elements, and if you go to the link of category, there are a few categories suggested by FHIR International. We have looked at the definition, and we feel survey, which comes closer to assessment tool, is the category we are recommending to use in this case. So I'm going to go through these things, and if any of you got any comments, please raise hands if you disagree, if you think we should be doing it differently. But I'll stop at some point to get further comments. Now, when it came to individual parameters for NEWS2, there was a number of ways we could model it. We could use observation.component, which is part of observation resource, and which gives you a code and value. So technically, we could have put observation component code is pulse, and this is the value. And that looks quite a simple design for it's in a single observation resource. And there is an existing example of FHIR on international APGAR score, which uses component. The other option we looked into is related. That we use observation.related. What it does allow is to create an external reference to observation, which sits on its own and can be reusable. For example, if we put observation here as blood pressure or pulse, they sit external to this resource and referenced, and that way the blood pressure is a reusable component which can be used in other scenarios as well, and I think that's the way we are recommending it's designed. We have to choose a relationship type, and we are recommending to use derived from. The NEWS2 score is derived from the blood pressure reading and pulse, and I think there are other kind of types available, but I think we think that's the best fit. So recommended option is 2, related, and I think the reason for that is the component, according to the FHIR International, should be only used when there's one method, one observation, one performer, one device at one time. So the only thing I can think which fits this definition is blood pressure, where you have systolic and diastolic blood pressure, and then you will use a component to say, because systolic and diastolic is done by one performer at one time, it will be good to use that. And related is used when the observation on its own has different values, and again, because NEWS2 has 6 to 7 components or 6 to 7 parameters which are used by different devices, could be the observation could happen at different times. So it makes sense to use related because that meets the criteria. The final link here is a discussion forum for where we can get some international feedback, and I posted that question, whether use component or related. Response I got was related is the best recommended option, so we are proposing to use that. So before I go to vital signs, does anybody got any kind of comments on this related or component, or everybody happy with that? Let me look at the chat window. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Amir. Okay, it seems I'm going to take that everybody's happy with that proposal and move on. I don't think that's much controversial. Okay, vital signs. So we don't have a UK vital signs at the moment, and I think this is our opportunity to look into it. So one option is that we use a Care Connect observation level 2 generic and issue implementation guidance, and say for respiration rate, for example, you can use this SNOMED code and you can use some units, and that will sit on a website. Now, or the option 2 is we create level 2 profile for each vital sign, and we fix the codes and we constrained. We call it level 2 because it's reusable. We believe blood pressure, pulse, and oxygen saturation will be reusable in multiple use cases, so we call it level 2. There are other considerations for this design. The other consideration is that the Vital Signs International, to be conformant to it, we actually have to create vital signs for these things because that's the way the international spec works. And they also, to be conformant, we have to use line codes, which we don't use in UK. So our recommendation is that as part of the alpha release, we will provide SNOMED CT codes for all observations like blood pressure and pulse, but also like magic codes, which will send along with it. And the recommendation within the UK would be to not to use line or ignore line codes, but they will be in the message to be conformant. But we expect most of the semantic work will be done using SNOMED CT code, and all the searching will work with SNOMED CT codes within the UK. And this is the point I made earlier in the call, that all the parameters like blood pressure, they will be profiled as minimal viable products. Like blood pressure will not have the cuff size and the position, and all possible notes for a blood pressure applies to other parameters as well. And we're not going to delete anything as per our generic principle. The level 2 vital sign will inherit all the nodes of level 2 observations. So this is what it looks like in our proposal, the UK Care Connect observation level 2. So first of all, we haven't got a level 2 of UK Care Connect. This is the first time we're going to create one. It will be based on a principle that level 2 will inherit everything from level from international. We will be adding some UK specific extension for SNOMED CT, but apart from that, we're going to keep it as close aligned to international pieces as possible. That will then create a UK Care Connect Vital Signs. The Vital Signs is a kind of a children of observation level 2, and the main reason for vital sign is conformance, and then under that we'll set blood pressure, respiration rate, oxygen saturation, pulse rate, and temperature. For NEWS2, we also have to create ACPVU. I talked about new confusion, so this is your alert new confusion, patient response to pain, verbal or unresponsive. So we have a profile for that, and it is created as level 2 because we feel, again, it's a reusable component which can be used in, as an independent ACPVU observation. Same with inspired oxygen will give you whether this patient is on air, on oxygen. And remember, there's a score of 0 and 2. We have to profile it separately because the score is separate. We couldn't profile with oxygen saturation because the scoring then becomes complicated. And the final is the level 2 subscore is the one which I will describe a bit more when we come to discussion on how to carry subscores for NEWS2. But I think the principle is a reusable which allows us to carry subscore for any parameter. So I think that's the overall proposal for vitals. I'm going to stop here to get some feedback. If people have got comments on the vital sign proposal, we should have profiled it differently or made it differently. I'm interested to hear from suppliers who would be implementing this. We'll start with Ben. Ben from Sona, do you have any view on that?
Hi.
Hi.
There's the main. We've already deployed NEWS2 along with some other early warning scores, the Pews and Cruise, and the main points I had at the moment was, firstly, in terms of we don't currently generate a sub-score. We only have a total score, and was just to try and understand a bit more about why it was felt the sub-score was necessary to communicate. The other aspects, the other main point was around currently, in order to have rather than having a different profile for each type of early warning score in terms of the pediatric or respiratory or we currently have a collection of, we actually have a collection of 4 observations, which there's a early warning score total a type, which then describes whether it's a news or pews, or and then we have a category in terms of green, amber, red as a collection of observations. And there's also actually a status observation, which is based on whether it's a full or complete set of observations, which I'm not fully up to speed with all the issues around that. But I was hoping to have another clinical lead on the call. But yeah, those are the main points from our perspective.
Thanks, Ben. So I think from subscore, the reason for including them is, one, the RCP guidance is a certain subscores are 3, then there is a different intervention and course of monitoring prescribed. So I think the subscores are clinically relevant on their own in some cases if they are going to extremes. And I think that was the reason for sending them. Apart from the overall design we're looking at is, I think we need to look into how scalable it would be, as you're saying, for other subscores, other scores when they come along, and how many level 3s we can have. But I think for news to that looked like quite a reasonable design to us, but I'm quite happy for your clinical lead to look into it and come back to us. And did you have any comments from Orion on this?
Yes, just wanted to pick up and discuss the category. I'm assuming that it's a recursive structure, so that there is a category at the news level, but there's also a category at the individual component level. So there'll be a category for respiration rate, category for oxygen saturation. You said you'd picked out a survey as the main one. Was that for the top level news category? Because I thought vital signs would be a more appropriate category for the component parts that make up the score.
No, I think I meant the survey category only applies to news to level 3. All the vital signs category would be actually to be conformant to the international specification, has to be vital signs. Okay.
And the other thing was, I remember back in June this year, we, on a previous curation call, discussed category when we were discussing, I think as part of transfer of care, what observations might be carried. And the value set was, you got some feedback from vendors about which categories they use for observations. I remember feeding back about half a dozen. Did you look at those when you made the decision to pick survey? Might there be one that's better?
Yeah, I think I asked Dave if we could fish that out. We couldn't look at it, but I think we'll look at it again. And if that's got an impact, then we can review it whether survey is the best option.
Okay, that's all I had.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So I think a lot of in case I don't know. I know a few vendors, but John, your hand is still up. Oops.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the issues we came across is the representation of, so we include subscores, but the representation of the news score, and particularly kind of the color coding that's part of the decision support. We, you know, that if we're going to calculate those scores, we're providing that decision support, so we don't want to rely on the consuming system to have to implement additional business logic to then calculate color or score again, for example. So the extension that we have added in is to provide both image support and color support for those scores coming through.
Right. Okay. So are you saying, apart from sending subscore, you are actually sending the color scheme as well?
Yeah, we've. I believe, although our integration lead is on the call too, but I believe we've implemented that through supporting sending a particular sort of image file through. But that is incredibly important from a clinical perspective. That at quick glance they immediately see the severity of the score. So it was a must for us and our customers that we talked about when we were consuming this data through a third-party system or a portal view that those colours were supported.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. We can consider that as a requirement internally if we could meet in the first phase. Okay, so I'm gonna ask some more suppliers. Matt from EMIS.
All seems fine to me, to be honest. I think if the preferred options, I think 2 definitely suits it best.
Okay.
But yeah,
thanks,
otherwise
Matt.
fine.
Okay, Michael Noonan from IMS. Oops.
That seems good for us. I think our use case is, or one of our use cases has been slightly different, where we've been capturing.
You're very faint, Michael. Do you want to project a bit?
Sorry, set of vital signs from a third party into the EPR, and that would have included new score, calculated new score. But yeah, no, this seems fine from my perspective.
Okay.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And Robert Backwards from Vision.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. You mentioned not including things like sort of posture and other sort of post-comment alter names. Is that definitely safe not to include that even as text, or? I mean, I'm a technical person rather than a clinical person, but.
I think we felt that it's not in NEWS2 score assessed with our CE guidance is not needed. We're not saying in future we want to include in future iteration of vital signs. We might, depending on the requirement,
right.
We might include it. But I think this is the alpha specification, so we want to quickly commit an alpha specification and with the vitals and see if we can get some feedback from first-type sites. If the feedback for certain things is that they are recorded routinely, we might consider them. But there is no harm in sending in free text if you got them. I would say yes, of course, send them as free text. But right now, all we're saying is we're not modeling them in the FHIR resource yet.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Will Jones, DXC.
And then put it back so it's still an
Will, we can't hear you. Okay. If you can put any comments in the chat window. Any other comments from anybody else? Neil from London, Neil Robinson, any comments from your perspective? IHE.
No, I think the only one that I posted up, and we haven't got to that point, was around the anatomy value set. Apart from that, no, it looks good.
Okay, thank you. We've got Amir.
Hi, I think it was John. Was it John that was just talking earlier about the colour coding? Was that right, Munish? Was it John?
Yeah, it was John.
Right, so John, I'm interested that you picked up on colour coding and clinical safety aspect of sharing. I didn't fully understand the structure, and I think I understood that you wanted to send a colour scheme with it. It'd be great if you could share that content on Riva, because I think it's important that we heed the clinical safety aspect and make sure we haven't missed anything. So if you could add a bit more detail around that and what that extension was, just so that we can understand it's compatible with anything that you're designing or using, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We'll do that.
Yeah, because I think if it's an extension, obviously, then it doesn't break your messaging or APIs, and hopefully we can see where it might fit in with the design we're doing. Because supporting implementers is
as is important, or those currently using system, as getting a spec that is, 100% foolproof. We actually want this to work and be usable.
Yeah. Many of you will know Manesh, our head of integration, but I'll have a chat with Manesh and we'll get those shared.
Yeah. Very good, John. Also, just do keep in mind that the color coding for News2 has changed, because based on feedback to deal with color blindness, it's no longer red, green, and all those colors. They have changed the colors to so that the people with color blindness could also see the colors. So I think that you might have to take that into account.
We've just released our News2 APIs, so we'll share that version.
Okay, that'll be great. Thank you. Okay, if there are no other comments or hands up, I'm going to move on. Okay. So we covered vitals, we covered observations. So now we are into the parameter score. So as we discussed that, the decision was made that not only we need to carry the total score, we need to carry subscores because they're clinically relevant. There are a number of options. Carrying subscore as a basic design was that we could carry the subscore with the referenced observation itself. Remember, I showed you earlier that related to reference and observation, which goes to external. So that's what it will look like. It will use, this is the total News2 observation profile, and it will have a reference to external blood pressure. So technically, the score could sit with blood pressure, or we could put the subscore of blood pressure with the News2. And I think what we're recommending is that the subscore sits with the News2 because it belongs to News2, and the blood pressure is a reusable component which is referenced, and we don't capture the subscore of that blood pressure there. So I think that's the logic behind it. But even if we do that, that creates a number of options, which is why I put it on River as well. One is we carry the subscore as a component in News2, which is empty in level 3. Second is we create a nested reference using related. I have a diagram for it, so I'll explain a bit more that we actually carry the subscore as a reference from News2 level 3, and then there's another reference from the subscore to the value. Option 3 is to create an extension in News2 to carry the subscores. So let's look at these options in a bit more detail. So option 1 is carrying individual parameters as subscore is a component. The pro is that we don't need extension. There is no nested reference. The cons that actually we don't get an explicit link between a subscore and value. So technically, apart from saying that this is a blood pressure subscore normal CT code, and this is the blood pressure reading, there is no link in the message itself. You could argue that that could be derived from a receiving system if they are reliably able to take those pneumatic CT codes and link them up, but that creates work for the receiving system to figure out which subscore belongs to which value. And so I think that's one of the reasons we're not recommending this option. This is option 2, which I talked about, the so-called nested references. So we carry the total score in the News2 level 3, and then there's a reference which goes to say, actually, this is the systolic subscore and its value is 2. From that, there's another reference to say, okay, this is the blood pressure, and the value is 100 millimeter of mercury. We're also recommending that this is a contained. It means that the subscore cannot be read independently of reading the News2 total score, so they are contained within a single. I think it has got some impact on RESTful API calls that, which I discussed with Dave, who could explain a bit more, that because it's contained, it would come back in a single call with all the subscores, and then you can retrieve the values in the next call. And finally, the third option is the parameter scores, which is that we create extension in the News subscore level 3 and have a code value pair. The code will carry the subscore of blood pressure, and the value would be 2. So, but the issue is that's a new extension, and the general principle is that we don't want to create extension in international profiles unless we have to. So based on that, we are recommending option 2 for carrying subscores and linking them up, and that's the way it will look like. Once again, open to the floor. Any question or comments on these options, or anybody's got different option for some reason they think they have recommendation. Okay, I'm going to start with Anne and Brian.
Can you come back to me? I'm still thinking about it.
Oh, all right. Okay, I'll come back to you later. Ben?
I think, yeah, using the related seems fine in terms of just to be aware. I think in release 4 they've removed related and they've split it out into different components. So there's a derived from and a member of, and then every other type of relationship is in extension. The only point is really would just be about the requiredness of the subscores and the derived from references. Currently,
they're all optional at the moment.
Okay, yeah, so that's how it, because currently we're generating scores, just total scores. They're so they're available, and that there is no references back to the signs that they were generated from, or the component scores. But I think if there's a structure there for populating them, and then that could be through implementation guidance that would be later, that they would, if it was felt that it was always necessary to send the subscore along with the reference to the derived vital sign. But just having the total score enough would seem to be a kind of minimum viable useful component.
Yeah, I think we discussed that. We don't want stop people sending total score if that's what they want to send. But
okay.
Again, the design has got capability to send subscores and values if that's what you want to do. But I think, again, our recommendation would be to send, subscores and values as well. But do understand that this is kind of a roadmap kind of thing. So if people do want to send just total score, that's fine. Okay. Any other comments from other suppliers?
This is Neil. Sorry, I can't put a hand up because I'm on an iPad.
Okay.
It's Neil. Okay. Just in the comments that Anne was making about automatic device loadings, does this, if we make it too complex, does it impose an unreasonable task on automatic uploads from devices? I don't know the answer. I'm just pushing it across. I guess Anne will know more.
Okay.
That question's really for the device manufacturers and their suppliers, but I can see the value of having the total score point to the subscores, which then points to the individual parts. But I can also see it the other way around, where the total scores point directly to the parts, and the subscore is really only a property of the observation, the blood pressure or the pulse observation in that context. So that's why I'm still kind of tossing up in my mind which is the better way to do it, because if you didn't have that subscore or you made that subscore optional, then it wouldn't impact on the device manufacturers as much.
Okay, so you're saying reversing the order of having news2, but then it can't be contained because people might want to plot blood pressure independent of news2.
Yeah, that's why I'm kind of 50-50. I can see it works both ways.
Yeah. So if we swap and have blood pressure, and then it won't be contained, and then a subscore out of it.
Because
Okay, Ian?
Yeah, I think in principle, I agree with probably both Anne and Ben that we don't want to put too many constraints here. I mean, obviously the News2 score is the one thing that we definitely want to move, but I can see all sorts of circumstances where people might want to just have the base observations, might want the subscores, might want both. I don't think we should, however we design it, I don't think we should impose any particular dependencies. So that we can mix and match these things depending on the exact use case and the local business requirements.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Mike Fisher.
Yeah, I just wanted to put out a bit of a plea, really, to the suppliers that are on the call. That I think it's absolutely right that we should have a structure that doesn't absolutely mandate subscores, but given that in order to calculate the News2 value in the first place, the system that originates the data must know firstly what the original observations were, and secondly what the subscore that derived from that was. It is really useful from a clinical point of view to know why somebody's News2 or news has gone off. So, I think if there wasn't a really, really solid reason why it couldn't be implemented to include the subscores in any message, whatever the exact format of that message is that we settle on, could I just put out a plea that people seriously consider that if they're going to share this data with an external system, to include the subscores as well if they possibly can.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Mark.
Hi, Manish.
Hi.
We opted option 3 in our design because I think, echoing another point, we want to graph blood pressure separately on occasion. So therefore we've been considering adding an extension to record the new score of the component values. There is to do it as contained resource, I think would be difficult. I'm not quite sure I understand option 2 entirely yet, so we get to see some examples there, but on River if possible. But we've been implementing, we're able to get a new score and all components resources back in one go simply by using the include parameter on our API call. So I think there's a way of doing, getting all that information back in one go without resourcing to having contained resources.
Okay, thanks. Can I bring Dave Barnett? And Dave, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I've exchanged email addresses with Mark anyway, so we'll probably take it offline. I guess we've gone for this design so far because the subscores are wholly contained within the overall score that they actually relate to, which doesn't really address Anne's point that you might want to chart subscores in their own right. I think it's worth exploring whether that's a requirement or not. And I think it's a good design to have the actual observations separate, so they can be used for other purposes and referenced by other assessment scales or other designs that might be going off within the system.
Okay. I just wanted to get feedback from other suppliers on option 2. So would Matt, do you have a view on this? I think you posted on Rival anyway that you prefer option 2, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I think for me it's just the way the data would be held sort of from a selfish perspective in EMIS Web, it kind of represents the best way that we'd store the data for kind of calculation. So.
Okay, thank you. Michael Noonan.
Hi, sorry. That kind of makes sense to me. I think where we've been coming from is that we've been providing a set of vital signs observations and including the scores as part of that
Okay.
So it's kind of, I suppose, what we've done looked at implementing so far has been more in line with option 3, but this option 2 makes perfect sense as well to me. So long as we can keep the the vital signs, the actual blood pressures, etc., separate and kind of reference those.
Okay.
Okay.
I got a hand up from Robin Breslin.
Yeah, I was just thinking if you force suppliers to fill in every data field in a connected structure, then in reality there might be workflows or information flows where a supplier is only providing one part of the chain of information. So they'll inevitably end up filling in a null value in the bits that they can't fill in. So I think you have to leave it free, that they can fill in what they know how to fill in and not make it mandatory.
So these are optional elements. I think the issue we got is that if the subscore is optional and it's not included, because we have linked the actual reading to the subscore now, if you don't include the subscore and you do want to include the reading, that's not possible in the current design.
Yeah.
So
I'm agreeing with that. I think it's the right way to go, but I'm explaining the reason not to mandate it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Robert, back with revision.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether a GP system would ever receive one of these or not. As I say, I'm more technical and clinical. So I don't know whether we would ever handle these or not. In general, I mean, hierarchies can be a bit brittle going forwards. Generally try and avoid hierarchies and have sort of other sorts of links between things that are a bit flexible. And presumably if you're exporting a care record, these blood pressures and other subscores would exist at the same level as a NEWS2 score as well, so you'd kind of be duplicating these if you're exporting a wider record. Whether that's I don't know how many NEWS2 scores you'd get for a patient in these settings. I haven't seen is it a daily thing or not. So
okay.
Generally prefer the sort of freer non-hierarchical approaches, but equally I'm less aware of the world where these are actually being used day to day. So.
Okay, thank you. Will Jones.
Hi, sorry I wasn't around before.
All right.
Right, I think for this new score, I think option 2 is what I would agree with for the following reasons. Those sub-scores are linked components to the overall NEWS2 score, and really they can't be separated out. If you start separating them out, they become meaningless, and they might become a bit of an issue clinically. If you, for example, split them out to in a stream for oxygen observations and link them to the oxygen observation, that would make that subscore meaningless. So it has to be linked to the overall NEWS2 score.
Okay, thank you. So you're happy with option 2 then?
Yes, that's the preferred option.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a few more hands up. Amish?
Yeah, I was just responding a GP colleague earlier about GPs sending and receiving. I think in the first instance, the workflow component is quite complex for us, and we probably wouldn't be interested in receiving the news as a key component to help us manage our patients. But I can imagine the subcomponents like the vital signs aspects over a period of time being helpful. So I think there's related components that are helpful here that we're developing. In terms of us scoring a patient and part of an admission process, I could imagine as we become more interoperable and we start communicating between systems, then yeah, I can see us collating the data. I've got a patient in front of me doing that score, and then we've got a connection to a local department and we send it through that way. But I guess that integrated care system workflow, that part feels a long way off for me. So that was just going to be my feedback from a jobbing GP working with patients.
Thanks, Amir. It's interesting that RCP report does mention primary care, but I think my current understanding is not used in primary care much. But I think...
I mean, it's on our sheets for when I do visits with patients, on our paper sheets. It's on there. We score patients. It, it helps us making a decision. But, visiting a patient versus actually having them in our consulting room when the computer's accessible, there's slightly different paradigms and workflows. I can imagine it being used, but then at the same time, we've got to target other workflows that are implementable today. Because as Ben has mentioned, STU4, STU5, all these other aspects may trump us when GP implement this for a workflow, but there are other use cases that need these solutions today.
Okay, thanks. Ben? Ben, we can't hear you. Are you double muted?
Sorry, I was double muted. Just a point in terms of this option 2 and the related reference, whether it's contained or just a reference. I think the preference would be on leaving that as optional as to whether it was contained or not, or whether it was just a reference and not. So as well as it being optional to have the subscore, also if you want to show the subscore, it can just be a simple reference, or you could have it as a contained reference, but not requiring it to be a contained reference.
Yeah, I think we had discussion on that as well, because technically there's a requirement, and there might be clinical requirement to plot the subscores over a period of time. And if we make them contained, you actually can't plot them because they are part of NEWS2 and you can't kind of independently pick them up and plot them. And that is something we'll have to look into. So yeah, I think that's a reasonable suggestion that whether they're we don't have to make it required for them to be contained. And sorry, Ben, did you have further comment?
Oh, that was all.
Yeah, thanks. Anne?
I've just been looking at one of the implementations that we have of the news form, and when we're talking about carrying the subscores and not requiring the consuming system to, derive all the business logic to work out what to do and how to escalate them, it just occurred to me that sometimes our news forms actually almost have some actions or some comments that say what the supposed escalation should be. So the clinical decision support aspect is baked into what gets carried as well. And I wondered whether you had considered that, or if there's space for that under comments or observation at the high level observation. So for example, one of ours says send a notification to the clinical care outreach team, and the other one sends as a clinical response team, and then you make some free text comments about what you want to tell that team.
So I would
to the total score overall.
Yeah, I think the observation has got a comment field anyway, so I think that could be used there, but we haven't actively recommended, but we could, I think we should, in our implementation guidance, to say, use the comment field to carry any kind of further actions or any note you want to send. I think that will make sense.
Otherwise, what you risk is losing data along the way, but the system that generated it has told you what should happen, what the escalation process should be, but the receiving system doesn't receive that.
Yeah, I think that's important. Thanks. Ian?
Hi, just for completeness, I argued unsuccessfully and clearly in a minority for option 1 to use the internal observation components to carry the subscores. I just still think that's a more elegant way of doing it. It keeps that bit of knowledge together within one profile, keeps the data together, because as somebody said earlier, I can't remember who it was, anyway, it keeps that data together. It just seems to me a better way of working, but clearly other people feel otherwise. I just thought I'd point that out in case I get any hidden supporters.
Okay, we'll see if we get any hidden supporters again. Ben?
No.
Okay, your hand is up from previous time.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. All right, have I missed anybody? Is there any other supplier want to come in support of Ian or option 2 or option 3 at this point? No? Okay, we'll move on. So I think what we're going to look into, we're going to still assume is option 2 because there's still quite a bit of support for it. We will look into the ordering of those references and whether they are contained or not. And I would recommend we carry on discussion on driver. There's already thread on NEWS2 feedback, and I think I would recommend everybody to kind of keep the conversation live there after this call. If you kind of have further insight after going back to your technical team or your clinical teams, either way, and if you let us know, we'll keep that in our design. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the related observation. I think there's not going to be much discussion. Most of them are quite simple, which is a code value pair respiration rate, because we are not adding any additional attributes at the moment. Then oxygen saturation is a little bit complicated, but I think what we are saying is we're going to provide 3 SNOMED code. You can send the oxygen saturation, but you can send that on air or supplemental oxygen. Also discuss on the air on oxygen is a separate Care Connect level 2, and a score would be sent separately as part of inspired oxygen level 2. Again, scale 1 and scale 2 will have SNOMED CT codes. We already have pre-release codes, and those will be used to differentiate within the scale 1 and scale 2 subscore. And you know, at this point, we are not saying that we'll be sending any related observation that this patient has got hypercapnic respiratory failure. Neither will be sending any kind of information about that the current oxygen flow rate of this patient is X or the inhaled device is this, because technically all these things could be sent, but for calculating NEWS2 score as such, all we need to know is scale 1 and scale 2 and their subscores, and all that information is more of a decision information which might be used on deciding which scale to be used. So that's the oxygen saturation. So blood pressure is quite simple. We said it will have 2 components. It will use the component part of observation to capture systolic and diastolic blood pressure. It will use the SNOMED codes and a unit. And once again, it won't have any other additional observation of the patient position of the cuff size. Again, observation, heart rate is quite simple with a code value pair. And then we have ACVPU profile, which will have a code for ACPVU to say this is the ACPVU scale in the observation.code, and number of these values, which includes new confusion as per the guidance. And then it will link to a score, which will give you score 0 for alert and 3 for everything else. Temperature is again straightforward, code value pair, and we're not adding any further kind of nodes to it at the moment. Inspired oxygen, as we discussed, will have 2 codes. The patient is breathing in room air or patient on oxygen, and based on that, we'll have a code of 0 or 2. That's it really in terms of our NEWS2 proposal and design. Do people have any further comments on individual observations? Would they want them anything further added to them, or they think that's all right for the basic design? Kevin?
Hi, just a quick question. There were a couple of codes missing there. If you go back one screen and another one. There, we're missing the top level codes for a number of these. So if we go to the oxygen one, which I think was the next one.
Yeah.
We've got the value codes there, but we need the parent code as well.
So they will be all generated as part of the release, so we have a spreadsheet with all the codes. So okay.
once we do the alpha spec, which is expected to come out next week actually, so you will have all the parent codes and the value codes, and with the implementation guidance where the parent code would go and where the value code would go. I think these slides are more indicative to say this is the overall high-level design. The complete list of codes we have, which we'll publish as part of alpha.
Is the code for News 2, I presume that's being prepared as well? Okay, that's fine.
But just do keep in mind that I'm sure our terminologist Jeremy and Andrew would want me to mention that they are pre-release Nomad code. So they will be actually released in April 2019. So they are subject to change, but we have some pre-release codes to keep us going for at least first of flight testing. Mike?
That's fine.
I just wanted to see what people thought about something, really. If you, I think in 2 screens' time, if you just move on, there's a observation. Keep going. Yes, this one. We've got an observation as to whether the person is on inspired oxygen or not. But actually, if we're using the codes for the oxygen saturation on room air or the oxygen saturation on supplemental oxygen, then this information is actually technically redundant. And obviously there is, I mean, I know it's not big, but there is a small overhead both in terms of implementation and in terms of consuming bandwidth for essentially transmitting the same information twice. I just wondered what people thought about that, and if they thought that we could actually dispense with what's on this screen here, because it can be inferred from the code as to whether the oxygen saturation was derived from breathing air or breathing oxygen.
Okay, so I think just before I bring other people in, the logic of having this was that because they have separate scores of 0 and 2, if we did build them in the patient, in the oxygen saturation itself, then we got 2 sub-scores combined in one when sending it to the receiving system. Because if the overall score is 4, then there'll be 2 based on patient is breathing on oxygen and 2 based on the oxygen saturation. And the reason for separating them was to we are able to comply with our pattern of having separate subscore and related observation by having them separately. And in cases people use that code for patient oxygen saturation on oxygen, that does create a duplication. But I think we have them separate to be crystal clear that this 2 score is coming because this patient on oxygen. And if we do combine them, and the sending system would have to put a business logic and do a calculation in before sending the message. So that will be overhead. But I'm quite happy to hear from other suppliers. So, Anne?
Yeah, I would support the way that it's defined there as a separate observation. That's the way that it's presented to our users on screen. They have to check a box to say, is the patient on air, yes or no? And then from that, we would infer what the correct SNOMED terms are to put into the shared data set.
Okay, thank you. Ben? Ben, are you double muted again? Can't hear you.
Hi, sorry, yep. It was just to make the point I made earlier about currently the way we've approached this is that we have a single early warning or early warning score total observation, and then that's paired along with a early warning score type observation that then determines whether it's a News 2 or Cruise or Pews or Muse, so all the maternal, respiratory or pediatric. So I'll post more, and there's also a category observation which does the green, amber, red, or whatever the colors are going to be, although I think that could be derived from the numeric, but in terms of whether there was an option to communicate that as well. I mean, the main point was really, I'll post more details about the current approach we have in terms of having a single early warning score total paired with a type. And I just wanted to, the other approach would be to have 4 different early warning score total profiles, you know, having a different profile for each maternity, pediatric. So I just wanted to get other thoughts on that and whether within the scope of your work package was to factor in the pediatric, maternal and respiratory stuff.
So the current scope is just News 2, but I'm happy to, because our general principle is that we design in a generic way, that we are, you know, we want to meet as many use cases as possible, and we want to be future-proof. And if you post us the detail, Ben, I mean, one of the options might be we create a generic level 2 sub-score or scoring system, and then News 2 becomes a child of that as a level 3, and the level 2 becomes a assessment scoring level 2, which can do any assessment with a score. And then we can kind of use that model if it works. But yeah, if you post us what you got,
I'll send more details. I just wanted to raise it now, just in case any thoughts or discussions from others on. But I'll post the detail about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ian.
I guess just related to that, you know, is it worth asking if News, at least the total score, should be in, you know, in along with that, given that, you know, News 2 is still very new, and I think people are still rolling out News itself. You know, is it worth just popping that in since we're here already?
Okay. Well, yeah, I think technically it's very easy to do. We will just provide the existing News code which we have. That's not an issue. But I think it's because the whole overall design is configured for News 2, including SP1 and SPO2 and confusion. My only concern is that if you do all that and then you end up sending News that might confuse. I would rather design News with its components and get rid of SP1, O2 and confusion and all that. So there are other factors, I think, about just switching the code there. So that's the reason I'm a bit reluctant. But happy to.
Yeah, it's only in the context. I mean, Ben's right. You know, there are a bunch of variants out there. You know, Muse and Pews and goodness knows what else. And if we are going to have a look at that, you know, is it an opportunity just to say, like, realistically, you know, are people still going to be using News for 3 or 4 years? If so, then, you know, it might be worth considering it. I think it'd be good to get some feedback from implementers about what the reality is on the ground.
Okay, yeah, so happy for people to come back to us on that. Well, I'm sure Jan and RCP hopes that's not the case, because News 2 was released last year, but I acknowledge the reality on the ground might be different. And you got your hand down, so no further comment. Kevin?
Sorry.
You do.
I was talking in on mute. I just wanted to come back to something you said right at the start around LOINC and that being the international preferred coding system versus SNOMED, which is what you've shown us here. Is the intention that you will specify the LOINC codes?
But the LOINC is already specified by HSON International, so we don't have to specify them. We'll just pick what they got. On the international LOINC magic value and international, and just put SNOMED codes next to it. But we don't have to specify LOINC magic values because they're already specified by international.
But not all the ones that you've got there are on that list, from what I can see. So the one about whether they're on air or not is not. There is no magic value for that.
No, because that's not a vital sign according to international LOINC. We only have to conform to what they classify as vital signs, which are very specific things. And because that's the reason in the table, ACP is not a child of vital sign, because actually we don't have to make this as a vital sign, and we don't think it is. So that's the reason we don't have to provide line codes of any of these. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. It's consistent, obviously, with the US core, but I don't see the point of it for the UK because we're not going to be using.
Well, I think they haven't given us much of an option, to be honest.
So it's not US core. It's the base FHIR specification. So the vital signs profiles, it's not part of US core. They were originally in DSTU2 defined in Argonaut, but in STU3 they're now part of the base profile specification.
So yeah, we investigated that, and we would love to dispense line code, but we can't because to be conformant to the base STU3, we have to use them.
But we only have to use 13 line codes.
Yeah, I guess my point was more just when you distribute the slides out, if you could make sure that those line codes are copied from the FHIR spec into them so you can see them side by side, yeah. And there's just less chance that someone will go to the spec and get the wrong one.
Okay. Yeah, I can include them in the slide pack in the appendix or final slide to line codes, but I think they will be part of the profiles which we'll release next week and the alpha specification anyway. But quite happy to publish in slides if that's helpful. Okay. Any other comments from anybody else at this point? Because I think we are pretty much at the end of the presentation, and only bit I want to say is if you are one of the suppliers who are early implementers, or you're one of the sites of first of type, or as a supplier, you know a site which would want to be first of type site, please do come back to us, because once we release alpha next week, the intention is to really test in a real environment if we could, and get some feedback and publish a beta. So if you got any, please do contact me or post on Driver, and would also like to include you in the upcoming meetings of core team, which are coupled next week, to go through the alpha spec and the clinical safety parts. But if you're one of the first of type sites or supplier, we encourage you to contact us. And that's that from me really for this presentation, unless anybody else has got any other comments in any other business at this point. Anything in the chat window? Okay, I think I have got nothing. So if there are no other comments, thanks for joining this call. Please carry on the conversation on Driver, and I'll pick them up and I'll respond as soon as I can. And have a good weekend, and thank you very much. Bye now.
Thanks very much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.